Tensions are mounting after Russia recognized two regions in eastern Ukraine as independent republics and sent what it called peacekeeping troops. The UN called the move a violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and the West has slapped new sanctions on Russia. How to look at Moscow's actions, what could be the consequences, and what's China's stand on the issue? I'm pleased to be joined by Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council from Moscow, Professor Wang Jiangyu of the School of Law of the City University of Hong Kong, and from Philadelphia, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, as Russia recognized the two republics in eastern Ukraine and sent what it calls peacekeeping troops in a televised address, Russian President Vladimir Putin blamed the eastward expansion of NATO. He said it would be just a matter of time for NATO to induct Ukraine and then build facilities in Ukraine so that the level of military threats to Russia will rise dramatically. He said the Western countries precisely ignored Russia's fundamental concerns and nothing has changed in their position. Russia has every right to take retaliatory measures to ensure its own security. Andrei, please help us understand the rationale behind Russia's moves.
Well, I think that Russia is indeed concerned about the NATO infrastructure moving closer to Russia's borders. On top of that, it's apparent that the Russian leadership is very disappointed with the Minsk agreement's implementation procedures. They tried very hard to incentivize Ukraine to comply with Minsk, and they hoped that the Western participants to the Minsk agreements, namely France and Germany, would exercise additional leverage on Kyiv in order to make the agreements work. But that didn't happen. I think there is a lot of frustration with the Western performance, not to mention the performance of Kyiv. And I think the conclusion was made that the only way to secure some stability in this part of Ukraine would be to formally recognize the two breakaway republics. Of course, they understand that the price for that will be high diplomatically and economically as well.
Brendan, how do you look at the kind of concerns that Russia has about NATO's eastward expansion and the fact that there were verbal agreement or promise not to expand eastward, but this agreement was eroded over the years?
I think we can address Russia's concerns about NATO if that was what the topic was. Russia can't decide. On one hand, they're concerned about NATO's eastward expansion, and they're talking about Ukraine as a conflict that they're being drawn into because of NATO's expansion. On the other hand, they're talking about a separatist action in eastern Ukraine, that they are now recognizing a breakaway state, a state that they have gone on to say is actually even more territory than the breakaway leaders were claiming themselves. I think the problem is that Russia is basically trying to have its cake and eat it too here. They're basically trying to justify a potential larger conflict in Ukraine by making this story both domestically and international about NATO, while finding justification to move their troops into eastern Ukraine about something that really has nothing to do with NATO. So for me, if Russia was being genuine about really being respecting, wanting to see a resolution to the Minsk Accords, and really how can we handle Donetsk and Luhansk, and how can we really find a future for this region, that would be one thing. But that doesn't seem to be what they're really concerned about. All of their coverage, almost all of their national propaganda is about NATO, which has nothing to do with the breakaway regions.
Andrei, your reaction?
Well, I think that in the eyes of the Russian leadership, these two issues are interconnected. On the one hand, I think the profound concern is not about Ukraine, it is about NATO. Ukraine is a part of a much larger problem that Russia believes it confronts. But I would also say that indeed there is a pressure on President Putin to recognize the republics because Ukraine started an economic blockade. Russia had to give citizenship to residents of this republic. So literally we now have more than 700,000 people living in Donbass who are Russian citizens. And I think mostly these people support President Putin. Definitely there is a strong pressure on the president to protect these people, because unfortunately from time to time we see escalation of tensions between the breakaway republics and Ukraine, and people are being killed, and they cannot plan their lives. So it is a pretty grim situation for everybody.
Professor Wang, some people are saying that Russia may have security concerns, but it may also have been a bit too paranoid about having a buffer zone between NATO and Russia because of the nature of modern warfare and the reach of modern military technology. For instance, such a buffer zone would be useless. What's your understanding?
Oh, thank you very much. I think the current situation is very much a result of both factors. On the one hand, you have the very complicated historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, which lasted for several hundred years. And so you have Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and they are looking for Russian protection, and they want to be part of Russia or the other arrangements. On the other hand, I think Russia does have a legitimate consideration with respect to security. In international relations, we talk about the security dilemma. If in the scenario without cooperation and trust, if one party becomes militarily much stronger than the other party would feel threatened and insecure. And this is exactly the situation. And the NATO enlargement has brought, heavy weapons, offensive weapons to Russian border. That naturally makes Russia very, 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 very concerned. I think these two factors cannot be separated. They must be addressed together.
Brendan, what is the U.S.'s role in this issue at this moment? The U.S. media, you were talking about Russian propaganda, but the U.S. media have very much hyped an invasion, and they were even given a specific date about it. What's the interest of the United States in seeing the issue flare up?
Well, I don't think the United States wants the issue to flare up. What I think we've seen is that U.S. President Biden has taken an approach to effectively try to call out what he believes is President Putin's views, goals, and strategies. That if he can't deploy troops to stop it, if he knows that sanctions are going to be reactionary rather than proactive in creating a stoppage to this, that basically he can say, hey, look, I'm not going to go along with this, allowing President Putin to set the narrative. I'm going to call out, hey, in a week he's going to see this, in 2 weeks he's going to say this, in 3 weeks he's going to say this. I think it's been very effective to sort of see President Biden effectively predicting the narrative that Russian leader President Putin is giving. And you see the U.S. media sort of following suit with that. You see a lot of them looking at movement of Russian troops. We saw even as the Russians were claiming they were pulling troops back, basically they did exactly what they did in Georgia in 2008, which was 7 days before they invaded Georgia. They said, we're pulling back, and then 7 days later they invaded. So we saw a very similar thing here. 4 or 5 days ago they said, oh, we're pulling back, and the United States says, nope, we don't see any evidence of that, and now we have them moving in as quote-unquote peacekeepers. So you have the United States sort of saying, look, we may not be putting troops on the ground, but we want to at least make sure that this narrative is called to account, and sort of say that, look, Russia may have problems or may have existential concerns about NATO, but right now this invasion is being predicated under respecting an independent, potentially breakaway provinces of Ukraine, which again, the two are not linked. It is effectively a fig leaf to allow Russia to expand its influence into Ukraine and push for an eventual resolution that either demilitarizes Ukraine or effectively removes Ukraine's ability to self-govern itself and pick its own allies.
Andre, your reaction, and what do you think has been the role of the U.S. government in all of this, and the kind of media voices about an imminent invasion of Russia leading up to the events?
Well, let me just say that I do hope that a full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine will not happen. I see what Russia can lose because of such an invasion, and the price tag will be very significant for Russia in terms of economic and political repercussions of such a move. And frankly, I don't see what Russia can gain by invading Ukraine if it is not ready to occupy the country. And Ukraine is not a small country. There are, more than 40 million people live in there. So I do believe that the Russian leadership would think twice before considering such an operation. When they're talking about the imminent invasion, I think that probably it's a kind of premature statement, because no one really knows what President Putin is going to do. I hope that he's a rational politician and he does his cost-benefit analysis, which will prevent him from invading the Ukraine. But of course, the Western media is biased, and they think that invasion is already happening, and apparently nothing can change these plans of Moscow. So we'll see. We'll see. A couple of days will tell us whether they are right or wrong.
China urged all parties to de-escalate the situation. Let's have a listen of what China's permanent representative to the United Nations, Zhang Jun, said on UN Security Council emergency meeting.
We welcome and encourage every effort for a diplomatic solution and call on all parties concerned to continue dialogue and consultation and seek reasonable solutions to address each other's concerns on the basis of equality and mutual respect.
Earlier, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi told U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in a phone call on Tuesday, which says the legitimate security concerns of any country must be respected and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be upheld. What has happened on the Ukraine issue has much to do with the long delay in the effective implementation of Minsk II agreements. China will continue to engage all parties according to the merits of the matter itself. Professor Wang, how do you understand China's position here?
The official message from Chinese senior officers seems to be that China is navigating a very delicate and a very subtle balance here. On the one hand, because China has always been advocating for complying with the UN Charter and respecting for countries' sovereignty and protect the country's territorial integrity. So it's very hard for China to lend legal or rhetorical support to one country's invasion of another country. On the other hand, in China, very much because it faces the same situation, same security dilemma situation in the Asia Pacific, I think it's actually quite sympathetic to what Russia faces, the same kind of security dilemma. So China would urge other countries to understand Russia's legitimate security concern, and China is actually opposed to NATO enlargement, as it is opposed to all kinds of other military alliances led by the U.S. And China calls for resolving all the disputes within the UN framework in the peaceful way. So that has been always been China's traditional position, but it also reflects China's dilemma.
Yeah. Another very quick issue, 20 seconds maybe. Some people have been consciously or unconsciously linking Taiwan with what happens in Ukraine. Is there a valid connection there? Professor Wang, 20 seconds, please.
Legally and morally, definitely no, because the Chinese position has always been that Taiwan is part of China. So the current situation in Taiwan is a result of a civil war, and Taiwan is never and will never be a sovereign state. And Ukraine is a sovereign state recognized by the international society and a member of the UN. So in that sense, you can't draw an analogy between Taiwan and Ukraine. On the other hand, you also have the implications. It's very hard to imagine the U.S. will send troops to protect Taiwan once something happens.
They are not sending troops to Ukraine either, but they are applying a lot of weapons, at least for now. Many thanks. We have to leave it there. Andre joining us from Moscow, Professor Wang from Hong Kong, and Brandon joining us from the United States. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin.